Tom Hartman in Washington, D.C., and here's what's coming up tonight on The Big Picture. Democrats need to win over the working class if they want to defeat Donald Trump, but despite what you've heard, that doesn't necessarily mean that they need to win back the Rust Belt. Steve Phillips will explain why in just a moment. And 1 month after it went down in flames, Republicans have found a way to make their abysmal health care plan even crueler. So with right-wingers fresh out of ideas, a single-payers moment finally arrived? That and more with Brian Pruitt and Nucci Courier in tonight's politics panel. For the past 6 months, a debate has raged within the Democratic Party about what exactly led to Donald Trump becoming president of the United States. Was it racism? Was it economics? Was it both? Well, according to a new analysis from the Washington Post, it was definitely racism. The Post looked at voter data from November and found that the connection between racist views and choice of candidate was higher in 2016 than in any election since 1988. But is that really the whole story? And where does this leave Democrats going forward? Joining me now is Steve Phillips, founder of Democracy in Color, senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, and author of Brown is the New White, How the Demographic Revolution Has Created a New American Majority. Steve, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Great to have you with us. So, first of all, there's this kind of this argument, this dynamic argument that's going on inside the Democratic Party about whether identity politics should be promoted. You know, it's about race, it's about gender, it's about sexuality or whatever, gender preferences, or whether it should be economics and just, you know, kind of a straight kind of Bernie economic message. But, you know, Bernie made the point that you can't disentangle the two. What are your thoughts on this whole?
Yeah, well, you can't disentangle them. I mean, the largest economic gaps are actually between the racial groups, right? And so that African Americans and Latinos have approximately 1/10 the assets that the average white family does. So that's a pretty core part and parcel of the current situation that we face. But you can't just talk about economics without talking about the reality of race, particularly in the context of a president's campaign like Trump's, which was deliberately designed to inflame the racial backlash against the progress of the past 50 years and against the Obama administration. So in terms of being able to be effective in that context, you have to speak to that explicitly. And I think the other thing that is also missing from the analysis of what actually happened is how many people voted third and fourth party. And so there's an assumption that all these people defected from Democrats and voted for Trump, and that's how he won. But Trump actually got fewer votes in Wisconsin than Romney did. Most of the Democratic drop-off went third and fourth party. So that actually is a bigger part of the story and a more important part analytically in terms of what actually happened than just looking at the defections of voters to Trump. But that's not really what actually happened.
So how should that inform action within the Democratic Party?
So then I think there is a piece there around the economics and inspiring people. So whatever it was, and whatever pieces that are meritorious around why people defected, we have to address that. And so I think there was an issue around inspiration, enthusiasm, being bolder in terms of the leadership. I do think it's reality that we have to be honest about in terms of, I think there's an element of sexism in this election, even among progressives. We don't like her, we're not going to vote for her, et cetera. But in terms of moving forward, inspiring and motivating the base, which is actually the majority of voters. This is the argument I try to make in my book. It's the argument we put out on our Democracy in Color website, which is return of the majority. The majority of people didn't vote for this president. The majority of people voted for the Democrat in 2008, 2012, 2016. So it's holding ourselves with the confidence that our views, our policies are the majority, and then moving aggressively and unapologetically in terms of putting those forward.
Yeah. Elizabeth Warren has been pointing out, and I actually wrote a book about this several years ago, essentially saying the same thing, you know, with many of the same statistics, that from the 1930s to the 1980s, we saw a substantial growth in the wealth of the bottom 90% of Americans.
Right.
And most of that was white wealth up until the 60s, and then black wealth started increasing as well. As a consequence of the efforts in the 60s, a whole variety of things. But by and large, from the 30s until the 80s, about 70% of all the new wealth generated was going to the bottom 90%. Right. From the day of Ronald Reagan's inauguration until today, literally, the percentage of new wealth being generated that's going to the bottom 70% is zero.
Yeah.
or the bottom 90% is zero.
Right.
And the amount of wealth going to black families has actually declined substantially.
Right.
And I'm not sure the numbers on Hispanics. That's powerful stuff.
Right.
How do you communicate that? And it's the kind of powerful stuff that you would think after a presidential campaign in which a Democrat running on a progressive platform,
Right.
You would think everybody would know this.
Right. Right.
How do we inform America about this? And why is it that the media seems, I understand why Fox would ever want to talk about it. They're the shills for billionaires, but the other networks?
Yeah, well, it's also, I think, the progressives and the Democrats, and particularly in terms of a lot of the consultant class in the Democratic Party, is that what I talk about is the tyranny of the white swing voter. And so there's all this fear around alienating that, alleged swing voters. You don't want to take a strong stand. If you talk about going after Wall Street, talk about taxing the 1%, how that's going to play, how that's going to alienate people. And so that paralyzes too many Democrats and really mutes their platform in ways that then leave them uninspiring to the grouping that's out there. Now, like, if we're trying to get to 50% plus one of an election, whatever happened to the 99% and 1% framework? That's actually not a bad framework to be very clearly on the side of the 99%. Right. But frankly, too many Democrats, I think, are afraid to actually talk about that level of inequality and to propose bold solutions which would actually redress it.
Well, maybe they're concerned that doing so would mean that they would have to take on the donor class, and
right.
they want the donor class too. I mean, Brian Fallon, Hillary Clinton's former spokesperson, has come right out and said that the strategy of the Democrats should not be to be going after working class people, but instead going after the white, affluent, largely Republican suburbs. And it seems to me like, of course you go after everybody,
right.
but this class construct, at the very least, within a multidimensional, multiracial,
right.
It seems more effective.
Yeah, no, I do think that there is fear of alienating the donors, because there's some personal relationships with there are a lot of Democrats on Wall Street, but if you start talking about a financial transaction tax, you're talking about a wealth tax instead of just an income tax, they're not going to be comfortable. Right. And I think that mutes the Democratic platform, and then the fear is then you won't be able to raise the resources. So that's one of the biggest parts of the Bernie Sanders campaign that the Democrats have not internalized. He raised $230 million. That's a lot of money in small dollar contributions, but there's not the confidence yet among the Democratic leadership that that's a viable funding stream.
Well, there's also, Bernie, literally never took money from billionaires. In fact, a very wealthy friend of mine called me up during the campaign, during the primary, and said, I want to write a check to Bernie for $1 million. And can you put me in touch? I did, and they said, we'll take $2,700.
Right.
That's the limit. Sorry. And he tried to talk him into it. And they were like, no. And so Bernie can go out and say, it's us against the billionaires. And he's not thinking in the back of his mind, I sure hope I'm not, angering Ralph,
Right, exactly.
Whereas so many other Democrats, in order to get elected, they have to go to people who are billionaires, they're progressive billionaires,
right.
And so you think that's driving that reluctance?
I think that almost in a subconscious way, because exactly that piece. It's not just I'm going to do, and I actually mentioned this to one buddy. As I said, I was talking about a financial transaction tax on Wall Street, and this person said, well, that will put me out of business.
Yeah, and so, because Jamie Dimon's a Democrat or something like that.
So there's specific people that that this proposal is going to impact, and they don't know as many poor people. Right. In terms of like, well, what are we doing for somebody who doesn't, have a job or is really trying to, struggle against the economic conditions? So,
right. Do you think that the Obama to Trump voters are salvageable?
Well, first of all, I don't think there are as many as people think there are, and so that's why I was saying that if it particularly most stark in Wisconsin, in that Trump got fewer voters than Romney, so there's almost no Obama to Trump voters in Wisconsin, but there's a ton of Obama to Johnson and Stein people, and that's how we wound up actually losing that state. So. It'll be interesting to see how they process. So the New York Times are doing a bunch of different pieces around how his policies are actually impacting some of these people who voted for him. One woman's husband has been deported since after voting for him. So it'll be interesting to see how they process that. But I don't think that's the most fruitful use of our time and energy. Yeah. It's really both getting back the people who defected to Johnson and Stein and then increasing the voters of color. That's where the largest potential lies.
The principal message of the Clinton campaign, at least as it looked to me, was that guy's terrible.
Right.
And And it still seems like there's a large chunk of that going on inside the Democratic Party, these evil Republicans. And you know, during the campaign, I had the Clinton communication, or the Democratic communication director on the radio show a number of times, and I kept saying, tell us what you're for. You know, let's run a positive campaign. Can we do this? And you know, it just kind of never happened. But do you see the Democratic Party waking up to the need to have a powerful, positive, consistent, bumper sticker-ish, if necessary, message that they can drive forward, rather than just, you know, we're not as bad as Paul Ryan. He wants to throw your grandma off the cliff.
Right. So I think there have been positive steps in different parts of the Democratic ecosystem. So what's happening in some of these House races is actually very encouraging. There's lots of energy and enthusiasm and activism, and the party and the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee is putting resources into contacting core Democratic voters, getting them to participate and getting them to actually come out, and rather than just wasting a lot of the money that they spend on television ads, often which are very negative in terms of how they move forward. And so Ossoff came very close to winning that Georgia 6 race there. That's an example, and I think his campaign was really more about, you know, standing up and being, you know, fairly unapologetic in his views. So that's, I think some of the Senate candidates are unclear and a little concerned. Well, my state's more moderate. What do I actually say, et cetera?
This is like the Heidi Heitkamp problem. I
yes,
guess.
that, and then Missouri, you know, Claire McCaskill. So that's why I think that Sherrod Brown's race is very important in Ohio, is that Sherrod is running as an unapologetic progressive.
Right. He always has.
Right, and he's won in trying to prove that that is actually a way that you can actually win. So that's, I think, why it's actually a very strategically important race. So.
Yeah. Real quickly, we just have 20 seconds. Do you think that Democrats who are discussing primarying people like Heidi Heitkamp are making a huge mistake?
I think we have to be strategic around it, in that if I'm not against primaries, but we also have to be, we're up against a major opposition in terms of this whole Trump administration, and we have to pick our battles very strategically to leverage the impact that we can have.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Steve, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
It's always great talking to you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Coming up, Republicans are on the cusp of introducing an updated version of their Obamacare replacement plan, and it's just as bad, maybe even worse, than its predecessor. The reason why in tonight's politics panel with Brian Pruitt and Nucci Courier right after the break.
All the world's a stage.
And all the news companies, merely players.
But what kind of part does RT America play?
RT America
offers more.
RT America offers more.
In many ways, the news landscape is just like the theater.
Real news,
Fake news.
Good actors.
bad actors,
And in the end,
you can never outwit your audience.
So what part can we play?
All the world's a stage.
all the world's a stage.
All the world's a stage.
And we are definitely a player.
I'm Larry King, and you are watching RT America. Question more.
I'm a trial lawyer. I've spent countless hours poring through documents that tell the story about the ugliest side of corporate America. Corporate media refuses to talk about these issues.
Conduct by this company was deplorable.
I'm going to paint a clear picture about how disturbing, how corrupt corporate conduct has become in modern America. These are stories that no one else can tell. I'm Mike Papantonio, host of America's Lawyer. Question more.
In case you're new to the game, this is how it works now. The economy is built around corporations. Corporations run Washington. Washington controls the media. The media controls the voters. Voters elected a businessman to run this country. Business equals power.
Boom bust. It's not business as usual. It's business like it's never been done before.
With House Republicans reportedly putting the finishing touches on a compromise deal, the GOP healthcare plan is officially back from the dead. But don't get your hopes up. The new Trump care is just as bad as the old Trump care. In fact, it might even be worse. For more on that, let's turn things over to tonight's politics panel. With me for tonight's panel are Brian Pruitt, contributor to Red State, and Nucci Courier, president of the Women's National Democratic Club, which is hosting an evening of progressive advocacy training and networking this Monday, April 24th, right here in Washington, D.C. And thank you to you both for being with me tonight.
Thank you for
Great
having
having
us.
you. Thank you. As part of a deal meant to coincide with Donald Trump's 100th day in office, the Freedom Caucus, I call them the Cokehead Caucus, and a more moderate group of House Republicans known as the Tuesday Group are putting the finishing touches on a new GOP health care plan, or at least they call it a health care plan. This new Republican health care plan would theoretically have an easier time passing the House than the old Obamacare replacement plan, but it would be a disaster for sick Americans. Not only would it let states opt out of rules that require insurance companies to cover vital services like hospital visits, it would also let them opt out of rules that prevent insurance companies from jacking up premiums on people with pre-existing conditions. This seems to be one of the only policies of Obamacare that most people agree is a good thing. Someone who's diagnosed with cancer shouldn't be knocked out of the insurance market because of their diagnosis. And yet here the Republicans are considering trashing this protection in order to please the House Freedom Caucus rather than 190-something Democrats. Does this make any sense to either of you?
First and foremost, it's important to note that Obamacare is collapsing under its own weight. And so we have to do something.
Obama's
or it will...
care, it's not collapsing. There are a couple of states where it's in trouble, and it's in trouble in those states because Marco Rubio championed ending the risk corridors, so there's no more subsidies to the insurance companies for bringing in sick people.
So right now the solution that the Republicans have come up with are these high-risk pools. Now, we're going to have the CBO cost outcome under the new plan, but I'm confident that the Republicans are going to at least work toward trying to get something that can get sent over to the Senate.
So, okay.
So I think we're now looking at more enraged town hall meetings. I think that we're now looking at, again, Republicans under attack. We already have Tom Cotton, who said that he has 300,000 constituents who are going to be at risk, and he will not support it.
And that's a great point, because that's because of the Medicaid expansion. The problem with Obamacare is it gave something, it basically created a new entitlement. An entitlement that was originally supposed to be, the Medicaid program, was originally supposed to be for indigent people, indigent and the very sick and very poor. Now we've expanded it to include people that are above the poverty line.
Well, within reason. I mean, if somebody making $20,000 a year,
it should actually really be single payer. It shouldn't even be considered an entitlement. It should be a right of every individual in this country to be covered like they are in most civilized countries. And so to even call it an entitlement, I think, is insulting the American people.
Yeah, I don't disagree, Brian.
Single payer would create a two-tiered system, one for most Americans that would be mediocre at best, and the people who could afford it and doctors who are extraordinarily talented would go into a cash system. Single payer is a nightmare for the vast majority of Americans.
Then why is it that every country that has it wants it? That when Canada flipped to a very conservative prime minister, the first thing he did is assure everybody we're not going to mess with health care. That when Maggie Thatcher took over the United Kingdom, she said we're going to strengthen the national health care system. That when Germany went, in the 80s, in the mid 80s, I'm forgetting, Helmut Kohl or whoever it was, the conservatives took over Germany. The first thing they did is they said they invented single payer health care in the 1890s in the Bismarck era. Every country in the world that has it loves it.
We're not every other country.
We're all human beings on this planet, Brian.
We take pride in being the best, creating the new
We have
drugs.
We have the 27th best outcome in the world out of 190 countries. We're not even in the top 10 in terms
All
of
of the
health
incentives
outcomes.
for creating healthier people exist in the United States.
all of the incentives. I don't understand.
Incentives for people to develop new drugs, to find cures for diseases. They all exist because of our system.
People are being deprived of health care. So you may develop the best systems in the world, but if you're depriving a huge section of your population, and if you weigh the two, what comes out on top? I think healthcare and education should be universally distributed like they are, again, in most civilized countries.
Yeah,
in Europe, for instance, you have even college, even specialization that's free.
Yeah.
And here, to go to college, you go bankrupt. To go into hospital, you go bankrupt. There's something a little bit wrong with that system.
I think okay. Arkansas's ghastly plan to execute 8 people in 11 days before running out of execution drugs has hit another roadblock. Court rulings have put on hold the planned state murder of at least one of 2 inmates who are scheduled to die tonight. This comes just a few days after the Supreme Court stayed the execution of death row inmate Don Davis, and as the execution warrants of other condemned inmates have begun to expire. This whole saga strikes me as horrifically barbaric. If we're going to try and differentiate ourselves from countries like North Korea and Iran, shouldn't we start by doing away with this racist death penalty? Nucci?
I absolutely agree with that. And I think that what is going on maybe should be strengthened further, because there are 8 people who are due to be executed in 11 days. And because a drug is going to expire in 5 days or something like that.
Yeah.
It's to me, is there a price to life that we assign, and if there is, what is that price? And given that some of these inmates haven't even had DNA testing to determine whether they are indeed guilty or not, there's really, like you just said, it appears to be discrimination against a certain segment of society.
Yeah, 40% of people on death row are black,
right.
13% of the population is, for example.
Right. First and foremost, I'm personally uncomfortable with the death penalty, but I think from a public policy standpoint, it's time for states to start being honest about what the death penalty is. It's killing somebody. And this over the last 2 decades, this attempt to make it palatable to the general public by putting basically euthanizing human beings has not worked. It doesn't work. It backfires. You know, we'd be better off letting the American people see through either, like we used to do, hangings or firing squads, like in the olden days, and let the American public make a real public policy decision about whether in 21st century America that if we're comfortable with that.
Yeah, we sanitize our wars. We never show the victims of our wars.
Well, we shouldn't do that either.
And we never show the victims of our death penalty. And I think, frankly, we need to be seeing both.
Yeah, we need to be seeing both.
I'm not really sure whether that's going to be a deterrent, because if you look at countries where they do have hangings, public hangings, you have spectators. It becomes a spectator sport. So I'm not quite sure whether that's the route.
That's more a reflection on human nature than it is the public policy.
Or perhaps culture, but But we used to do that in the United States, public hangings and things.
Right,
and I think gradually it fell out of favor because so many people were offended by it.
Right.
So it's an interesting question, you know, whether it would die of its own weight, and whether those countries that have public executions, if nobody, is it possible, like in Saudi Arabia, for example, where it's, you know, regularly beheading.
Or even Afghanistan, meaning I have visions of some film footage that I've seen where there are these bloodthirsty, blood-curdling cries of support for the executioner, not the executed.
Right.
The truly offensive part about this is it's become completely randomized. One person dies, one person lives, and you can't have a system of justice that is random.
Yeah, excellent point. And now we're down to, you know, a dozen or so countries in the world that practice the death penalty, and they're not the countries that typically America would want to associate itself with.
But in addition to that, we need to take a harder look at incarceration, our policy related to that.
Oh yeah, and Michael Moore did a brilliant job of that in his last movie.
Yeah.
It's just to put a plug in for it. Well, today is 420. Pot smokers celebrating 420 today have more reason to be paranoid than usual. With Jefferson Beauregard Sessions III in charge of the Justice Department, the war on drugs looks like it's about to make a comeback. But the Trump administration as a whole still has no clear position on marijuana. In the span of just a few days this week, for example, Homeland Security Secretary John Kelly went from saying that marijuana was no part in the drug war to calling it a dangerous gateway drug whose use is against federal law. So where do you all think the Trump administration ends up falling on this? And is everybody, singing different songs because Jared Kushner hasn't yet come out with a public policy?
Or there hasn't been a tweet.
Yeah.
They would be well advised to go back to a conservative ideal of federalism. Let states do what they want to do. If you let the secretary is correct and we need to admit that it's not great to just always be using marijuana. If you go into downtown Denver, there's a lot of vagrancy. The vagrancy rate is on the rise. We can't say that there are no harmful effects, but they're no more or less harmful than alcohol.
It's actually a lot less harmful than alcohol. 50,000 Americans die from alcohol every year, directly. Nobody dies.
We're not bringing back prohibition.
If they want to be conservative, they would go with federalism and let each state regulate it.
Federalism is actually liberal. It's, it was the founders' idea. This is part of the Enlightenment.
Right.
This is the liberal Enlightenment. This was John Hobbes, or not
small
John
letter
Locke.
L, small letter L, not liberal,
well,
democratic.
I wouldn't. Actually, I think it kind of transcends both.
But the bigger point that the Secretary was making, Secretary Kelly was making, is that the government, the legislators have a responsibility to change the laws if they don't like it. The executive department must enforce the federal law, and that's the point that he was trying to get.
Well, they have discretion not to, which is what was exercised during the Obama administration.
They actually, their job is to enforce the law. Obama chose not to, but that doesn't mean it wasn't his obligation.
Right, there's this thing called prosecutorial discretion.
But it's all about dilly-dallying, because there is no clear-cut agenda here on the part of the ruling elite at the moment. And so one day it is okay, and the next day it's not okay.
And I think it's like one day the drug companies are saying yes, and the other day they're not saying no.
Right. So with all this influence.
We're out of time, but thank you so much for both of you for being with us.
Thank you so much.
And now the big picture fact of the day. According to a new report from the American Lung Association, roughly 4 in 10 Americans live in places where the air is literally dangerous to breathe. If Scott Pruitt and Donald Trump get their way, that number is going to get much, much higher. And that's the way it is tonight. And don't forget, democracy is not a spectator sport. Get out there, get active, tag, you're it.